Hello, and thank you for joining us for this FORTIFY webinar on financial scenario planning, a 5-step process. My name is Janine Mason. I'm the Executive Director and founder of the Fieldstone Leadership Network San Diego, and I'm proud to welcome you today on behalf of our partner, the Nonprofit Institute at the University of San Diego. FORTIFY is a webinar series that we crafted together to strengthen the leadership, well-being, and sustainability of nonprofit leaders and organizations. To help to make the most of your time with us together today, I'd like to go over just a few housekeeping things. If you're having any technical difficulties whatsoever, please feel free to contact Cynthia. You can do so using her email, which you'll see on the screen, or you can contact Cynthia using the chat box, and she will be available to help you in whatever way she can. All of you are muted today on our webinar. We will take questions, and we will use the time at the end of the webinar to answer questions and to talk with our facilitator and our presenter today. So if you have questions, please put those in the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And if you have resources or comments or things that you would like to add and to share with the community that's gathered together today, please put those in the chat box, and we will gather all of that information and share it with you after the webinar. We are going to have after hours today, which is an extended time for questions in case people need additional information, and we have an awful lot of questions. So don't panic if you're feeling like we're coming close to our time barrier at 1 o'clock. We will stay on for an additional 10 or 15 minutes so that we can make sure that we get everybody's questions answered. We are recording this webinar, and it will be available both on the Fieldstone Leadership San Diego webpage as well as the Nonprofit Institute's webpage. And in addition to the recording, we also will share with you the resources that we talk about today in our webinar. We know that many of you are new to either Fieldstone or the Nonprofit Institute, and we'd like to welcome you to this program. And we'd also like to welcome you to our networks and to our academic programs. So if you're interested in joining either Fieldstone or the Nonprofit Institute, you'll see our email addresses there on the bottom of the screen, and we would love for you to visit us and find out more information and become involved with us. As I mentioned, our speaker will be available for about 10 minutes after the webinar. So if you have additional questions or you want something that's very specific, please feel free to stay with us for about 10 minutes after the webinar concludes today. It's my privilege to introduce to you Lynne Corbett. Lynne is the Director of Governance and Community Programs at the University of San Diego Nonprofit Institute. He's also a doctoral candidate in the School of Leadership and Education Sciences. And it's been a great pleasure of mine to be able to work with Lynne to curate and present FORTIFY. And so with that, I will turn it over to Lynne.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're excited to have you. As Janine mentioned, we are excited about this partnership and working together to figure out what are the needs, how to meet the needs of what people have been asking for. As for many of you, if you have not already done this, we continually try to survey the community to identify what their specific needs are and then try and work to address them. So if you could look, as the data has shown us, at least some of the initial data that we've actually been showing to some of the politicians and some of the decision makers, because one of the things people asked is to sharing real-time data. So 72% have been consistently saying, well, this is great, but things are changing so consistently. So how do you make sure our data is shared real-time? So we've done first round, second round of surveys, and we're going to continue to try and keep this work going. People have asked for reevaluating fundraising strategies. We've had a webinar on that that's been saved that you can access. They've asked for guidance for their board of directors. We did a governance training a couple of weeks ago. And like Janine mentioned, it's really organizational focus and then individual focused. So we're really looking towards that. And 61% said financial scenario planning. And through many of our conversations, that has significantly increased, we believe. So we thought that we'd spend this time here trying to help to provide you specifically what you need. There was a session last Friday on personal resilience, and we'll put this in the chat window, but if there are people who are looking for coaching to receive coaching. We put together over 75 coaches that have been able to provide sessions for free nonprofit leaders in the community that need that support. So that'll be in the chat window for you. And then if, as Janine mentioned, any other resources that you have, we think is going to be important to you, that would be important to make sure you let us know about it. And again, as always, if you receive a survey from us, please make sure that you fill it out and pass it to others who may not receive it, because it's going to be important for us to continue to keep this data coming, because it's even for us, it's we do deal with data all the time. The data that's coming in is a consistently changing, consistently moving target. So we thank you for your presence here today. And I'd like at this time to introduce you to our presenter here. His name is Bob Beatty. He's been in charge of Bob Beatty and Company, providing financial consulting services to nonprofits in Southern California. He is the principal consultant, and he brings a perspective that includes fundraising, health and human services, grant making, and government programs. The projects have included cash flow, restructuring, turnaround, staff organization, and back office consolidation. A related function of his work has been to assist boards in carrying out their governance responsibilities. To that end, he uses a collaborative and informed process that maintains focus on the board's collective and individual duty of care and the duty of loyalty. He has been an instructor in our program at the Nonprofit Institute, and he's also an adjunct faculty member at the University of San Diego. So please join me in welcoming Bob Beatty to the webinar.
Great, thanks, Lynn. Let me see, let me pull up the presentation. So we've got a presentation to kind of walk through, and it's a series of steps, but I guess I should make one disclaimer at the beginning that I'm a big Peter Drucker guy. He's one of my professors in school, so I tend to quote him and use a lot of his thinking. And if I say anything remotely sounding smart today, credit it to Peter. So one of his great lines is, the best way to predict the future is to create it, which is essentially what we're trying to do here in this process. And as we said in the intro email that went out, really this current crisis, it's a great opportunity to really focus back on the mission and start really succeeding in the organization and not just get through it at a minimum. It's really important, at least from my perspective, that when we talk about scenario planning, anything financial, it needs to be tied into the core mission and the org's values, really understanding the priorities of the organization and using metrics and other forms of budgeting. It's really important rather than just throwing numbers on a page. So we've got, 5 steps we've outlined. It's far from easy, but it's in concept, it's simple. So the 5 R's are really first to kind of look at, to reaffirm. We'll talk about each one of these in depth, and refocus the organization, resource it, and reassess it, and then rebudget, which is kind of what everybody's probably most interested in. But I think it's really important to go in this order as opposed to jumping right to the numbers. So on the reaffirm, it's, I'd like to do this at every board meeting, but at all times, let's get really clear. Do we understand the core mission deliverables of the organization? And let's not talk about just in generics. Let's talk about, here's the results that we're trying to achieve, and here are the outcomes we're trying to achieve over what period of time. And don't talk about programs so much as you're doing that. Refocus, this is a really interesting concept of Drucker's, is concentration and abandonment. It's a twofold process. What you want to do is really understand what is the work and programs that we are doing that we have to in order to meet our mission deliverables. Then, yes?
I want to just let you know, you're not sharing your screen.
Oh, I'm not.
Okay, it looks like Cynthia just put it up now. I just wanted to make sure that.
Oh, okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Let me know if that doesn't continue to move through as we go on. So again, concentration and abandonment. Concentrate on the things that you have to do and stop doing what you don't need to do, the things that are not contributing to the mission. A lot of times, especially, we get into this this kind of catch-22. Why we do things is because we've always done them, or our funders require it. This is a great opportunity to come back and really refocus the organization on its core mission. Let's make sure that, you know, with our current funders, let's talk to them as we get them back to funding our core mission deliverables. Negotiate with them. It's never going to be perfect, but move them our direction. And make sure that you find ones, you focus on the ones that are actually funding your whole organization, the mission, the overhead, which is part of the mission. You can't do it without the overhead. And actively be seeking, is there any new funders now that we're really clear on our mission focus, our back to our core mission? Is there anybody who really is better aligned with our mission? And then start looking and saying, hey, if you're not well aligned with us, maybe we should separate you as funders and deal with the expense aspects of that. I'm not saying this is easy, but again, same thing with our vendors. You know, you got to talk to all your vendors. Is there any way to negotiate anything in this situation? Your landlords, service providers, everybody's working to try to keep things flowing, and we need to, you know, have them bend over backwards. And then as you replace a vendor, make sure that they're always somebody that's clearly aligned with your mission, or better aligned with your mission than your existing vendors. So on the reassessment, what we have to do is we have to start at the point and say, how long do we have if nothing changes substantially in the organization, right? So step one of reassessment is, how long do we have? And I'm going to approach this in two basic ways. One is, if you're an organization with with reserves, there's a different way of thinking about it versus if you have no cash reserves and you're really just, you know, getting by. So first, what you want to know is, what is our cash position, or our liquid unrestricted net assets, which is a fairly simple calculation, which we'll look at in a little bit. But if you don't have reserves, or little of them, then really, how much cash you have in your bank account? Do you have a line of credit? And if you have one, how much availability do you have on it? And then, do we have any investments? Which again, those might have come down in the last so many months. If you have reserves, a much better approach is to not focus on cash itself, but to focus on Luna. So basically, Luna, liquid unrestricted net assets, is you take your unrestricted net assets and you subtract out the equity you've got in a building, because you can't spend that equity to pay salaries, okay? So generally now, as you get larger and more sophisticated, there's some other adjustments that we want to do there, but we really want to know, when we talk about your unrestricted net assets, how much is available to spend now to meet the mission. Then what we're going to do is convert that. We want to figure out how much Luna liquidity we've got, call it Luna L. And generally you take your Luna, the number you calculated right above, and you're going to divide the average number of your monthly budget expenses into that. So take 1 month of your 12-month budget going forward and divide it into your Luna, okay? And what that'll tell you is how much Luna you have if no more revenue came in from this point forward. How long could you survive? I'll probably, oh yeah, go ahead and perform these for the last, say, 3 fiscal years, and then for every single month of this fiscal year to date. So it basically gives you the Luna liquidity trend, you know, what's been happening over time. And then, you know, you also, if you've, again, this is presuming you've got reserves, how many is the minimum you want to get down to? If you've got 12 months of Luna liquidity, what are you willing to go down to? 6 months, 4 months, 5 months? I should mention that the overall average in both San Diego and California is between 1 and 2 months. So if you don't see a big number here when you do this calculation, don't be surprised. Okay. So then we now know what our historical liquidity, or Luna liquidity, or our cash position is. We know what we've got. Now, step 2 is how long can we move forward? So we really want to start talking about a concept of cash burn, or if you're using Luna, net asset burn. Okay, what's that rate? If you don't have reserves, you want to now, from this point forward, what is going to come in and out every day for the next daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and annually. You want to say, if it's a revenue number, you want to assign probabilities to it. If it's an expense, the same thing. Is there any surprises in here that you want to be in? You want to be conservative as you go through this analysis. You don't want the wrong kind of surprise. Yeah, look at your contracts, your payroll taxes. Really important to get debt payments in there because they don't show up on a lot of people's budgets, especially if you're not doing a cash budget. Make sure you add in some expense for COVID-19 related stuff, whether you're going to have to start providing PPE, the cleaning costs of facilities that you're working in, the cost of thermometers, or whatever it's going to be that you're going to add to your operations. Make sure you get some number in there for it. And then it's really just on a daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, annual basis, the net between revenues or cash receipts and cash expenses is going to be your cash burn rate, right? So how much are you burning in each period? And that's what you need to get to that. If you've got reserves, you can use Luna, and because you have reserves, you can just focus on pretty much like a monthly basis and focus on just your revenue expenses. Debt payments aren't critical here because of the way Luna works with the equity fixed assets. So if you're paying down your debt, it actually works itself out. And then your net asset burn rate is how much a month do you burn, or are you adding to it? Okay. Then what you want to do is kind of combine the two. And so when we want to know, when are we going to either run out of cash, or when are we going to hit that floor that we established, 4 months, 3 months, 6 months of Luna liquidity. So you start with whatever your cash balance was, or your Luna balance. And then every month, every period, you want to subtract those ins and out, the net in and out of revenue and expense, or cash in and out. So what I've got on the chart here is, say, starting in April out for a year, the first line is your beginning cash or your Luna balance. Then your cash in, or your revenue, depending what it is, your cash out, or your expenses if you're using Luna, and then your net cash or your net asset burn. So in this case, we had an organization that in April, they had $35,000 in revenue or cash came in, $40,000 went out. And so for a net of $5,000, so they went from $100,000 at the beginning period of the period to $95,000. Okay. Now down below that is an estimate. What I did is here, just for simplicity, is I took the monthly expenses that we figured we were going to have for the next 12 months, and I averaged those numbers. And in this case, I just took 40,000. You can manipulate those however you want to. But you take your 40,000, and so that becomes your average, however you want it, whatever your actual average is. And you can calculate how many months of Luna liquidity you've got. Again, this is presuming you've got reserves. And then so you take your 95,000 divided by your 40,000, leaving you with 2.375. And in this hypothetical case, we said our target Luna liquidity is 1.5 months. We don't want to go below that if we can all avoid it. So in the first month, we're okay. We're above, we have more Luna liquidity than we're above our target. Okay. So the next month you start with 95,000. You have some revenue and expense for a net. And so you know, no change in, so Lynne liquidity stays the same. And you keep doing this every month. This number you're ending becomes the beginning of the next month, and it just moves across. What's happening here is the general net loss trend is we went from 2.375 months of Luna liquidity, starting by August, and then September, we're down to about 1.816 months. So we're getting really close to our target floor, or zero if you're using cash. And then here's where the indication is: if we do nothing, we're going to run out of cash or Luna liquidity in about 6 months from now. In the end of October, we'll be below where we want to be. So clearly, so now you know we've got to probably do something fairly dramatic if we're going to keep things functioning. We're going to be in fairly big trouble here in these later months. Okay, so now we kind of know where we're at and what our situation is. Next step is to rebudget. Okay, and so in this process, I want to talk about three things. I want to talk about zero-based budgeting. I want to talk about metrics-based budgeting, and I want to talk about multi-year budgeting. And essentially, you need to do all three to make this make sense. So we'll do the zero-based budget. And in here, you need to be linking any expense item you put in to the budget. You need to link it to something like revenues. So it's really clear of the connection here. We're not just doing it because it was that much last month or last year, but how is this expense item relating to revenue? If you can't tie it to revenue, then it's basically quasi-fixed, and it's your starting point for here's something that we need to maybe think about reducing our cost. So make sure you identify things that are primarily affected by COVID-19. So if your organization holds gatherings, and as a result of that, you have revenue or mission deliverables. So that's going to be a big thing. You need to, your ability, how are you going to retain sufficient staff, say 6 to 12 months until we get a vaccine, whatever that timing is. Contract requirements, because if maybe you can't get revenue because you don't have the staff, you don't have availability of staff, so you can't make that stuff work. Again, mentioning this idea of PPE and other materials, of service expense, inefficiency in your office. Do you have to pay somebody to go down and wipe things off that you didn't have to pay them to do this before? Are you going to either have actual or plan for additional sick time, PTO requirements? Do you have to provide some training that you didn't have before? And quite possibly new technology expense, just to keep doing the business the way you've been doing. What is a Zoom license cost that you didn't have before? So take your April 2020, which is probably our best representative month. Everybody's going to be a little unique here, but that was a absolutely full quarantine month, and we now have the April numbers. Take that and modify your revenue projections to reflect what happened in April for the rest of the year. You can adjust it up. You can say, yeah, in 6 months, we're going to start doing this, but be conservative. Don't assume more revenue is going to come in. The more conservative you are, the better, because you can always adjust. You can always add expense later. It's something you don't want to be doing if you don't have to, though. So make sure on your salaries, every single person that has a salary in the organization, there should be a subschedule in your model. And it's got their name, their salary, the variable benefits, the taxes that are related to the salary, and fixed benefits like medical insurance. You either have it or you don't, and that's a fixed dollar amount. And then that schedule links into the main line item for salary expense, salary and benefit expense. Then take all your other expense line items, and as you add expenses and you identify them, create a separate schedule for them, because that's where in these details, that's where you're going to be modifying things, not on the summary tab for your budget. And then you want to have a column that allows you to change anything on that schedule. So if it's a salary, you want to be able to change somebody's salary on a certain month, starting a certain month going forward, and returning it back to a certain salary after a certain period of time. You might not be able to cut certain expenses until 3 months from now, but you want to be able to put in there on that month, we're going to cut our salary or cut that expense line item. And you want it by month as you're building out these schedules, because again, you're going to be manipulating and moving these every single month and making new decisions, and you want them just to flow into the regular budget. And then every single month, when you get new revenue numbers and your new actual expenses and new information, you're going to update all of those subschedules so they flow into the new revenue model. You might get a really positive surprise that revenue is better than you were thinking. So you want to make sure that gets reflected in. And that's going to, again, flow out into your loan liquidity models. So that's kind of your zero-based, really question everything that's going into the budget, make sure it ties into a revenue item or a mission deliverable, and you can be really clear on it, okay? The next piece is being metrics driven, which is kind of it's a little bit alien for a lot of people, but it's really driving your budget from the metrics instead of from the line items themselves, okay? On that one we just finished, on the zero-based basic budget, you want to calculate the relationship between each expense line item and a financial output. So for instance, here's our fundraising expense, and connect that to fundraising results. If it's reimbursable expenses, and to tie it into your contract revenue and know what those numbers are. Is it 3 to 1? Do you have $3 of, or $1 of fundraising expense for every $3 of fundraising results? What is your actual history? What's your budgeted plan for that right now? When you do these calculations, you can start to see what's really driving, what are the underlying drivers of revenue into the organization? And is there any expense items that we need to look at again? So back to fundraising expense. If fundraising expense exceeds your fundraising results, you got to do something. I don't know what that answer is, but clearly that's not working. But really importantly, usually your fundraising results need to be a multiple of your fundraising expense, not just dollar for dollar. Otherwise, you're just spending money to get money, and it's washing itself out. Then you have overhead costs that might be not being covered by as you drop your revenue projections. So what are you going to do to get those overhead costs in line with your new revenue? Obviously, many nonprofits, the primary expenses, the biggest bucket of expense on the budget ends up being salary related. So can you either, what happens if you reduce overall salaries or targeted salaries by say 5, 10, 20, 30%, or if you eliminated certain positions for a certain period of time. Now, again, those are easy decisions. None of this is simple because you don't want to lose capacity in the long run to deal with something in the short run. But there's an old line, they used to talk to a bank robber and they said, why do you rob banks? And he said, that's where the money is. So you essentially want to start with these big buckets of budget expense. And when you're looking at the calculations, what is having the biggest impact on revenue? As you're doing these calcs, you're going to incorporate now, this is kind of the twist, you're going to take the expense lines, what are those underlying formulas, and you flip them on themselves. So now you talk about what happens if fundraising results go from X to Y multiple. because that's what happened in the last month. They actually improved or they got worse. So we have a new normal on our metrics, and we're going to apply our metrics to our expenses, not just cut the expenses or cut the revenue. So if, say, your fundraising results are 2 times your expenses, and next month you do your May numbers and it turns out it looks like the new normal is 1.9x, you want to now take whatever you had in the projections before and reduce them, apply this new metric to it. Always exceptions. There's a lot of reasons for this, but you really want to be looking at the underlying metrics and managing the budget using those, not just the gross line item numbers. Now you can start to predict when the underlying results are going to change, because you could be saying, for our organization, the work is for the next month or the next 3 months, we're basically shut down. But on this such and such a date, or if these conditions happen, we think we can open back up this and this and this. And that's when these underlying results are going to start to improve. And you have a story now about why you think that's going to happen. Ultimately, when you flow these out, especially through the next, when we talk about multi-year budgeting, these are going to all flow into your coming up with your overall cost per mission deliverable. Okay. So multi-year budgeting, I think I can just click on that. This is really the key. Most organizations, if a budget is a financial representation of the organization's strategy, and you're doing an annual budget, I can almost guarantee your budget doesn't reflect a strategy, because it's a 1-year piece of a multi-year project. Everything we're doing in this industry is multi-year periods of time to get these outcomes and these results. So we need to be budgeting and matching that. Okay. At a bare minimum, you need to be doing 2 years of budgeting. Really 3 to 5 is your target of what you want to be doing. You're building out every single month based on these underlying metrics, not just everything's going to go up 5%. It's what's going to happen to our expense for fundraising or our program expense, and how many results do we get as a result of that. You want to make sure as you're building that, you've got a way to convert every month into a cash-based budget that's going to pick up the Luna results. It's actually, it sounds maybe a little complicated. This is actually the easiest piece to add into it. And then make sure you're always showing the underlying metrics for the key line items, your salary expense and that sort of thing. Once you do that, and anybody takes a look at it, but most importantly, your board and your other stakeholders, they can focus on the relationship between the mission deliverables, your productivity, and liquidity, because those are really the 3 big trade-offs that are changing over time. You might you might give up some of your liquidity in order to get better productivity. You might have to invest add a little more expense somewhere, a little cash, pay a little more, and not necessarily get the revenue today, but you're going to get your mission deliverables. When you summarize this, which I've done many times, essentially you've got a fairly complex model, but on a simple summary sheet, what you're going to show is it's going to tell a story of, okay, here's where we were, our liquidity and our metrics and our underlying processes. Here's how we've pared back. We've now reconcentrated on our core mission, and we're abandoning these other programs. Our liquidity is going to take a 3 to 6 to 9 month hit, but here's the results that we're going to get. And after this period of time, year 1.5, year 2, year 2.5, is where you're going to start seeing the change and the uplift in liquidity and productivity and mission deliverables. And that should, as you're approaching new funders today, or maybe even existing funders, and explaining why you need them to change or align your funding with what you need, now you've got a great story that you can apply and do all these changes to. And at every month, or as the new reality, something changes, you can adjust this budget in the underlying schedules and do what if this happened, or what if we come back a month early, and you can start to see the impact of that. And that's essentially financial scenario planning. And with that, I think I'm done with the slides. Yes. So how do I unshare now? Cynthia, you might have to unshare my screen now.
Oh yeah, I stopped sharing.
Okay.
Great. So we'd like to open it up to everyone. Does anyone have any questions for Bob? I'm not seeing any questions in either the chat or the Q&A.
Okay.
You went through your slides really quickly, Bob, to allow us to have a lot of time for questions. So if anybody has any specific, oh, here they come. Okay. Oh, the first one, yes. The person who's asking, all of our webinars are recorded and they'll be available on our webpage. And then there's another question, Bob says, do you have an example spreadsheet with the metrics that you could provide to us?
No, because everything I've got is client specific, some of my clients, and I found it's really difficult to strip out enough so it's not identifiable to a client and still retain the value. But let me think about that and see if there's a way. I've done it. We do some stuff for a class, and Dr. Lamb and I wrote an article in a recent textbook on multi-year budgeting that has all these underlying factors. It's not COVID-19 specific, but it does talk about scenario planning, and there's probably a way we can make that somehow. I'm not sure with the publishing rights who has the ability to, if we can share that out without paying for the book. So but yeah, so I'll have to think about if there's a way just to do one specifically for this.
We do have a hand raised from Rocio. Rocio, I'm going to allow you to talk and ask Bob your question.
Actually, I just typed it, but I will tell you. So I know that you talked about payroll expense, and being that payroll is one of the largest expense that we have. You talked about making a list of all the employees and putting their salaries and putting benefits, taxes, et cetera, and tying it back, linking it back to the budget. In agencies that have multiple programs, so you suggest that each program will do it by individual program and then upload it as a total?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, that's what we're doing, so, okay. Mm-hmm.
But I also, what I tend to do on that is I'll create a summary salary page as well. So I'll take each of those subschedules for each program's salaries and move them over or combine them into another one. So.
Right. Did you have any recommendations as
I'm sorry, recommendations?
Did we lose her?
I think it cut off.
All right, well, let's go to another question and then we'll see if we can get her back. So Bob, I have a couple other questions. One says revenue predictions can be hard for more than a few months out. Do you have suggestions about how to estimate those numbers?
Yeah, I would take, so you have an existing budget for revenue by month, I'm assuming, out, when you built your budget this year, you had some assumptions in that. And hopefully you've got it by month. Now you've got an April budget to actual, right? You've got your April actual results. So what was the percentage of that revenue, particularly take every single line item and say, here was what we were budgeting for here, $100 of the revenue this month for that. We only got $50. And it's because of, say, COVID, or it's not because of COVID. But essentially your new budget is 50% for that revenue line item, right? And I would take every other month moving forward and reduce it by that factor, say 50%, unless you've got some good reason or some explanation. If it's strictly a timing difference of when you were supposed to get a funder paying something, that's different. But it's take your April budget actual, compare those two and apply those percentages out on every revenue line item that you've got for the rest of your budget period. And then as you get, if you've got the underlying metrics, the better you understand what happened in April, the better you can now start adjusting those future months. And just update them every single month and make sure you're looking at it like that often and continuously.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bob. We have another question. While I'm a fan of multi-year budgets, now more than ever, it seems incredibly difficult to do. We have a significant percentage of government contracts, and the verdict is still out on what will happen to them. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think especially if they're particularly California state funding, I think the federal is probably going to be okay, but California state funding is highly at risk. I would definitely be starting with the assumptions that what if, and now you can come up with 3 scenarios if we get 100% of what we expected before, if it gets dropped by 80 and 60%, to pick somewhat random numbers, because I think what gets cut is always going to be a little bit of a game. And then the key is that as you get information, and information from the state starts to come out, you can start adjusting those immediately again in that underlying schedule, so that you're not locked into this whatever presumption you made. At some point, we'll get some clarity on this funding, but that's where you want to be able to apply those underlying metrics to say 60, 70, 80, 90% of what you planned and adjust those. I would start fairly aggressively unless you have some inside information on your particular funding, your particular program funding, if it's safe.
One other question. If an organization has some reserves, what percentage of that should be quote unquote no touch? And instead we continue to cut costs. For example, larger layoffs. Is keeping 2 to 3 months, as you mentioned in the beginning, reasonable? I think my larger question is, at what point should an organization go dark and wait for better times?
Yeah, and there's no magic answer to that. And I've, my various clients, everybody assumes, because I think there's some old rules of thumb that, oh, you should have 6 months of reserves. That, to me, the amount of reserves you need is unique to every organization, fairly much, and you need to analyze a number of factors about your sources of revenue and how the cash flows. What I think works best is if you do that historical, you go back a couple of years, 2 to 3 years, and then year to date, and you get a sense of where you've been, right? Has it grown over those 3 years and now it's starting to go down? Or has it been 6 months, 7 months, and now you have some kind of a frame? It's probably not going to increase. So you kind of look at it and you say, well, we were pretty comfortable. And again, it's a board and management conservative positioning, how conservative you are. And if you say, we thought we were pretty good back at that point a year or so ago when we had 4 months. So it's kind of like, let's set that 4 months as our general target. The combination you want to look at is if you get aggressive and you had 6 months and you think you're willing to go down to 4, if you take it all the way down to 2, then you've got to be really conservative on your projections, on your expense projections, and because your forewarning of when you hit that floor is going to come up too often. I like proposing somewhere between where everybody's truly says, this is our bottom line, we can't go below this, and or where we've, the peak where we've been. I like a midpoint between there, because that'll give us more time as every month goes by to look and say, is this gap between the midpoint and our true floor, is that approaching? Now we have to make some harder decisions, like completely going dark or continuing to invest because something's happened on the revenue scenario, or might be happening on a revenue scenario. But it's a unique to each organization, and I definitely would have the board involved, because it's really, in a perfect world, you'd have all this already built into your reserve policy. But you know, if in the event you don't, and even if you do, it's a good time to revisit it, just to make sure you understand why you're setting that floor where you're setting it. I don't know. I hope that answers your question. But
great. One other question. If we start with the idea that staffing and people are the most important aspect of any organization, but also likely the most expensive, how do we balance keeping good people at a time when budget reductions may be needed?
Yeah, I think that I've seen a combination so far of like salary cuts, especially for the more highly paid staff, and you'd call them temporary targeted salary reductions. At some point, it's maybe, is there a way to reduce salaries to a certain point more across the board, and having everybody feeling joined in the process, versus having to go in and select and identify certain people or positions that need to be eliminated, especially if they're critical to the mission. But again, it's a balancing point between how much can you get by cutting everybody by 5% or so, and how much can you get by just doing a couple of big ones targeted, or by eliminating positions entirely. And it all needs to flow back into the impact on the mission itself, and that's why overhead positions are easier to do those reductions in. I think the other thing to consider, even though I think there's some open question here, sometimes if you reduce the hours of certain staff, it may be possible for them to continue to work for you, say 20 hours a week, and possibly apply for unemployment, particularly the federal piece of that. And that might take care of the employees, keep them in the queue, and not lose them for when your revenues do come back.
Thank you. One last question. A large percentage of our revenue comes from one large-scale event. With the future of large-scale events still a bit uncertain, this makes projections difficult. Would you recommend building this out with a few different scenarios? For example, projections assuming we're able to hold our event as usual, projections assuming some reduced event, etc., or just to add, or just to adjust as we have more information?
No, I would definitely look at least 3 scenarios of what's going to happen with that revenue, because it might be a combination of things. Let's say that event is usually 6 months from now, not right in the immediate time, but still in that question mark. We don't know yet what that's going to be. I would say, certainly don't assume 100%, because I think that's wishful thinking, although it could happen. But take some fairly significant stabs at it to say, we're going to cancel it completely. We're going to get only 50% and maybe 75%, right? What do we need to do in that event that that's what happens. What do we need to do to our cost structure to allow for that, or to how much of our liquidity, our current liquidity reserves, are we going to tap into to allow for that? The other thing that you might be able to do, and I have heard a little bit of this, that by using, you know, all the new technology that's coming and getting better and better at it, it's possible that you might retain a significant portion of that event revenue without anywhere near as much of the event expense. But that's something to build into as a, what if we did these kind of, invested in this kind of expenses, technology or whatever it is, that'll allow us to maybe hold the event differently and retain significant amounts of the revenue. So definitely I'd look at, I'd have definite scenarios for if you can have the event, if it's 50%, 75%, and if you maybe have a different cost structure for the event because the world has changed.
Great, thank you, Bob. One last call for questions. I think we've taken care of everything so far in the chat and in the Q&A box. So if you have something that you are burning to ask Bob, now would be the time. Otherwise, we will let you all go and get on with your day. All right, it looks like we're good. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to remind you that Friday, our webinar is on mindfulness and self-care. That will be Friday at noon, and information on how to register for that webinar is available both on the Nonprofit Institute's website and on the Fieldstone Leadership Network San Diego website. So please join us if you're able to. And Bob, on behalf of USD and the Nonprofit Institute and Fieldstone Leadership Network San Diego, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. It's critically important as everybody's trying to navigate different scenarios and be prepared for whatever plan and whatever path unveils itself for us in the future. So we really appreciate you taking your time today to share your expertise with us.
So thanks for the opportunity.
All right, thank you everyone. Have a nice day.